You might have wondered how Iceland and Greenland got their names. It's an especially interesting question because their names seem to reflect the exact opposite of their countries. While Iceland certainly has its colder regions, there are also forests with lush green valleys. Greenland, on the other hand, is devoid of such wondrous flora, and is mainly a barren landscape of icy plains and snow-capped rocks. Over 80% of Greenland is covered in ice. So, how did they get their names? Was it a practical joke played on everybody by the Vikings? Myths certainly suggest this. However, the official answer has more to do with Scandinavian history and climatic changes. First off, let's bust some myths. One often espoused theory claims that Viking settlers first came across Iceland and they were blown away by its greenness. It was the perfect place to start new life. Plenty of fish, forests, moderate temperature. The myth then goes on that these settlers intentionally named the new region Iceland to dissuade any of the other settlers or invaders from staking a claim to it. According to folklore, the same Vikings were also well aware of the icy mass of land out to the west, and let its name be Greenland. They were more than happy for anyone to be lured into there under the false hope of colonizing and maybe settling down for good. This myth sounds good, but it's too simple to be true. Mainly because it is. Evidence of climate change in Northern Hemisphere and record-keeping by Scandinavians in medieval times suggest a far more likely set of reasons. The best versions we have of how the naming occurred is from people reporting events orally from the 10th century until around the 13th century when writing official records began. Iceland was the first to be settled, but it went through a few names before people settled on calling it Iceland. In the 9th century, several Scandinavian explorers made their way to Iceland. First was a Norwegian called Nadod the Viking, who found Iceland after being blown off his course. It was during winter that Nadod was far from impressed. After a half-hearted attempt at settling on the east coast, he dismissively called it Snowland and made his way back to Norway. Next was Gardar the Swede, in around 860 CE. Gardar's timing was better, and he landed in Iceland in a warmer time of the year. He established a small settlement to the north of Iceland and left, calling it the not-so-humble Gardar's Garden. Then came Scandinavian explorer Flóki Vilgerðarson, about 10 years later. Flóki had heard about Iceland's potential from Gardar and decided to see for himself. Unfortunately, it wasn't the most fruitful of expeditions. Flóki finally arrived and started up a settlement at Borgarfjord, which is not far from modern-day Reykjavik. Borgarfjord was in the southwest of Iceland, which was also one of its most temperate areas. Flóki and his settlers brought livestock to farm, and they were very pleased to find a healthy supply of fish in the nearby sea. However, they failed to plant enough crops for their livestock, which soon perished. Then came the telling moment. Flóki's efforts to return to Norway were further hindered by huge ice blocks that obstructed his way out of the fjords. Disheartened by the entire experience, he bitterly named the new land Iceland. However, members of his expedition party were insistent that Iceland was in fact quite suitable for farming. The soil was fertile and there was plenty supply of fish. This was huge news for many. At the time, Norway was running out of good arable land and the land taxes were high. The option of relocating to this mysterious new land was very appealing to some. And so, towards the end of the 9th century, settlers gradually made their way to Iceland. Whatever people thought of the new land, the name had stuck. Regardless of the conditions of the landscape, it was to be known as Iceland. It wasn't long before Norse explorers were becoming aware of another landmass in the northern seas. Unbeknownst to them, unique climatic conditions had transformed this new land into a seemingly viable option for settlement. From about 900 CE to 1300 CE, the temperatures of Greenland were higher than they are today. Through scientific analysis of flora, ice core, and mollusk shells, it's been confirmed that the North Atlantic region was going through what's called a medieval warm period. This saw temperatures in the area become significantly warmer than what was the norm. As a result, Greenland had more grassy regions and vegetation than was to come in future years. Following the medieval warm period was a significant cooling of temperatures known as the Little Ice Age. Erik Thorvaldsson was a Norse explorer who played a major part in the naming of Greenland. He was famously known as Erik the Red due to his flowing red beard. Erik was born in Norway and spent significant parts of his life at sea in Iceland and Greenland. Although there were other Norse explorers who had discovered Greenland before, none had been able to successfully settle the considerable landmass. In the late 10th century, Iceland was populated by large numbers of Vikings. Disputes were common, and Erik the Red was expelled from Iceland for manslaughter. He decided to sail west and see what opportunities had awaited for him there. In around 982 CE, he had arrived at the southern tip of Greenland. Due to the unusually warm climate, it was grassy and scattered with trees and vegetation. Erik the Red liked what he saw and started up a settlement with livestock and farmhouses. Erik and his party explored much of the southern and western areas of the new territory. In 985, he returned to Iceland full of optimism. He called the new land Greenland, in hope that the positive-sounding name would attract settlers. By the late 10th century, people were starting to leave and make a new life in this new Greenland. Initial numbers were small, with only 400 to 500 people making their way and settling. And gradually, the climate began to cool down, and the medieval warm period was coming to an end. Right on its tail was a North Atlantic mini ice age. This was to guarantee that the settlement in Greenland would prove to be almost impossible. Research teams have studied ancient plants and glacier sediment from the North Atlantic region surrounding Iceland and Greenland. They were able to conclude that a mini ice age most likely took place from 1300 to the early 16th century. Ice sheets expanded, causing temperatures to drop, and cooling off in the northern hemisphere began to kick in. Although the temperatures in the affected areas only dropped about 2 degrees Celsius, the effects for many were profound. Greenland in particular was transformed, with ice forming over most of the landscape and the country becoming virtually uninhabitable. Viking populations in particular tried their utmost to survive in these freezing conditions, but it was in vain. Greenland was much more severely affected by the small ice age than Iceland and other countries, and gradually it became covered in ice, leading to the most incongruous of naming. While emotion and circumstance certainly played its part in the naming of Iceland and Greenland, nature might have had the last word here. Greenland's ice sheet is slowly melting, which should give way to more vegetation and an actual green Greenland. At the same time, the North Atlantic area around Iceland is becoming colder due to the melting ice sheets. This slows down the warming currents of the Gulf Stream, which in turn can make Iceland icy. It seems as though that at the end of the day, nature might have the final say again in these naming rights.